Welcome to Capital Conversations. I'm Marty Owings. It's Tuesday, March 25th, 2014. Tonight I'm happy to be joined by GOP Representative Tim Driscoll from Sartell and Environs, and he's joining us tonight on the program to fill us in a little bit on some taxes and other subjects. We'll cover a wide range, but let's start off with that. Welcome to the program, Representative Driscoll.
Thank you. Yes, and it's O'Driscoll with the Irish
O'Driscoll,
part of it. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
Apologies.
No worries, just to help you with some of the details on that.
You got to get it right. If you don't get it right, that's it's important for your campaign literature.
There you go.
At the very minimum.
And it helps throughout the mail internally in the House, too. So.
Yeah, we don't want it going to just any Driscoll down there. No, I appreciate you coming on.
Happy to be here with
Representative
you,
O'Driscoll. Okay, let's start off with taxes. Where are we at? What's going on? We had a tax bill signed and passed here. Governor Dayton signed it into law. Your thoughts about the process, what Minnesotans ended up with?
Well, you know, last year when we finished session, it seemed like we were in a real hurry to put in some business-to-business taxes that we couldn't get those taxes on fast enough. When I say we, the majority was looking at putting those in. Some ag taxes on business equipment, some business-to-business taxes. And even before session began, there was a big push to try to take those taxes out. And the very first day we were in session, the House Tax Committee was already starting to hold hearings to repeal those taxes. There was a lot of discussion about how onerous those could be on businesses here in the state of Minnesota. And I think that once we got out of session and the majority party heard more about what we were saying were some of those oppressive taxes, they and the governor wanted to start backing off on that. And so the House did pass about 2.5 weeks ago their version of the tax bill, and just on Friday of this past week, the Senate passed theirs. And we ultimately went with the Senate package on that. Didn't refund quite as much money to the taxpayers in Minnesota as we would have seen in the House bill, but nonetheless, some of that's going back. And so we're looking at a half a banana is better than no banana at all when it comes to those taxes. The other thing that's important for tax filers to know is on your 2013 tax return, if you have filed a tax return right now, you will have the opportunity to amend that tax return and being able to apply for some of the deductions that weren't allowed because of tax conformity. But the marriage penalty will stay in place for 2013, but Minnesotans will be able to enjoy that again in 2014 along with some other deductions that we were trying to get taken care of last year, but for various reasons never got included in the tax bill.
Well, how involved were Republicans in the crafting of what's in the bill? Apart from, you know, you're mentioning that Democrats and the governor reconsidered after you know, I'm sure they heard a lot from their own constituents as well, but how much involvement did you have this session versus last?
You know, when the tax bill was being crafted last year, we were advising that these were some difficult taxes, and there was some testimony that was in there. I'd like to say that we were very involved because we were able to get most of those things rolled back that we said that were onerous last year. And I think that the people in the state of Minnesota stepped forward and said, we agree that those are things that really just need to be repealed in the way of the tax code in Minnesota.
Mm. So do you think this sudden agreeability came from in terms of the DFL?
Again, I do believe that they heard from the same constituency that we were hearing from in our districts and saying, hey, this is onerous and this is for real. And when they started seeing what was happening to businesses, and particularly that warehouse tax that was in there, there were a lot of warehouse services businesses that were saying, we have a choice. We can either build in Minnesota or go to North Dakota. And there was a mass exodus of plans going to North Dakota and abandoning the state of Minnesota as the place that they would do those warehouses to provide those warehouse services.
Okay. Well, what are you hearing about I'm interested in what you're hearing on the bonding bill. What's the scuttlebutt here?
Well, the last year's agreement on the bonding bill was that this session, which is the 2014 session, which is typically the bonding year, and 2013, which is the budget year, there was an agreement that we would spend a little bit less than $1 billion between the 2 years. Last year, we had the veterans homes that were included, and a few other projects that were included for about $150 to $200 million. So it means there's about $750 million to $800 million left in the agreement from last year between the House and the Senate and what would be going in. The governor had asked over the summer for communities to come forward and say what would they like to be looking at in the way of bills and projects, and to submit those to the governor. And of course, members always get from their local districts things that they're looking for, or that the locals would like to have.
Sure, you used to call it pork.
Some people call it pork, and some of it you could literally say is pork, and other you could say is truly needs and necessities.
Sure,
I mean,
absolutely.
there are smaller communities across the state that and counties that need to have potable water, and for them to be able to afford and to put on their taxpayers the cost of putting some of those things together can be onerous. And so, if we want to treat all Minnesotans fairly, that's a way to be able to do is through the bonding bill on that. We are oversubscribed by about $3.5 billion with a B dollars on that. With what the governor was looking at and with all of the House projects that are in. So there's only $800 million to go around roughly, and we've got $3.5 billion worth of requests. Representative Hausman, who is the chair of the bonding committee in the House, put out her plan, which is at about $1.2 billion. So she knows she's going to end up having to pare some of that back to about $400 million out of that bill, but it is available online with some of the different projects that are in there. And of course, before session began, the governor put out what he thought he'd like to see in the plans and the projects as well. Senate has been a little bit silent on what they're looking for in the way of priorities at this time as well. So it's still a little bit early in the session for us to know what the bonding bill is going to look like. But again, the structure has been put in place, and we have every reason to believe that the deal that was agreed upon last year will be the deal that will come to fruition this year. What projects are in there? Still a little bit of negotiating yet.
Sure. Well, last session, Representative Hausman walked off the floor when she was disappointed that even her own party couldn't get together on a bonding bill, which she thought she had assurances that they were close on. Sounds like it's in large measure the same proposal that they had talked about last session. I mean, maybe there's a few things different, but they've talked about the $1.2 billion surplus. I'm sure the Republicans have some notion of what a surplus is versus, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the Democrats want to figure out a way to work with that. And it seems coincidental that it's a $1.2 billion bonding bill and there's a $1.2 billion surplus. Your thoughts on that?
Well, two things. One, the bonding bill that was put forward that was voted down, and that you said, as you reminded us, that Representative Hausman walked off the floor in disgust as that went down. And it wasn't a bill that I quite frankly don't think was going to meet with success, because it was the first year, which is a budget year. This is a bonding related activity and kind of clouding the two activities together. And so we did come back with a smaller, more immediate need for the state of Minnesota. There were some federal dollars that were available to help expand and to finish the phases of the Veterans Home in Minneapolis, which is extremely important to everyone, and a couple of other projects that there was some state matching money. And of course, the building that we're sitting in right now, the Capitol building, is on a multi-year restoration, and we didn't want to stop and put a break in that, because we're on a roll with getting some of those things done with this beautiful asset that is the People's House in the way of the Capitol building. And so coming back to that $800 million, that's bonding. The 1.2 you're talking about came as a result of the $2.4 billion worth of tax increases that had happened last year, leaving the $1.2 billion surplus. Net, there's about half of that left because of the tax relief bill that we just talked about in the earlier part of the segment today.
Fair
and
enough,
so there's
but that wouldn't have been there had the Democrats not recognized that they needed to repeal some of the other
correct.
onerous, you characterize them as onerous taxes.
Well, I'm characterizing it as the people who've come to me who have to pay those taxes, and the businesses and the employers who are saying they're onerous. It doesn't allow us to be able to grow and expand our businesses here in the state of Minnesota.
Fair enough.
Within that $400 million tax bill, there was also additional monies that were going into the state's rainy day fund on that. So I suppose you could put forward and say, had we not done those taxes, we probably would have been revenue neutral this year as a result of some of those activities.
Yeah. What about Representative Hausman's contention that that would have been a good time to do it because the bonding rates were favorable, construction costs were lower, and by waiting we kind of did the taxpayer a disservice in terms of not striking while the iron was hot, so to speak?
There's a couple things you have to look at on that. As far as where the economy is at, it's slightly recovering from where we were maybe this time last year.
Sure.
Interest rates haven't moved all that much. It's not like they were at 2% and now they're at 12% or any dramatic move on that. It's still
Right.
staying pretty much in the same range, so I think we're going to have the same benefits from that perspective. The thing to remember is that not all of the things that are in the bonding project are construction projects. It's not a construction bill, it's a bonding bill, where
Right.
sometimes there are general transfer payments to purchase assets, lands or buildings or some of those kinds of things that don't necessarily have construction
Sure.
attached to them. So it's not that there was $1.2 billion in her proposal that aren't going out in construction projects.
Right.
Yes, embedded in there were some.
What about the, you know, every time there's a bonding year, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans in charge, they seem to trot out these numbers about how many jobs it will create in the state. 21,000 is the latest figure that the governor has thrown out. Where do you stand on the numbers, and what do those really mean?
You know, Representative Mike Nelson, a DFLer who is the chair of the Government Operations Committee, and I both have a similar philosophy on this, and that is the jobs that are in the bonding bill are in construction jobs, because he's got a construction background and has worked in the industry. He said, you know, when you start a construction job, you're actually working yourself out of a job because there's a start date and there's a completion date for that. And that's really what we're seeing in a lot of these different bills as well. It may give people some employment for a 3 or 6 month period of time while those projects are going on, but it isn't that there's built-in reoccurring jobs that come as a result in the way of construction. The facilities that are built, there may be some additional jobs that come as a result of how that facility is used to create some jobs, but they don't typically have permanent long-term employment connected to them.
Fair enough. Okay. When we're talking about billions of dollars with the big, you know, B,
The B.
why not? I mean, that seems like there should be some jobs, you know, long-term construction, especially when you look at the condition of our roads and bridges in the state and kind of the disrepair there. And geez, it seems like it's a cycle. You know, I can drive down 35, they repair the road, 3 years later they're digging it up again. What are your thoughts there? Why can't it be a little bit, you know? Would it make sense to invest long-term in kind of an ongoing sort of, you know, infrastructure agenda?
You know, if I were the chair of the bonding committee, I would, and this is going to be radical for some people, but when I bring it forward, they go, yeah, I agree. I would make at least 50% of that bonding bill road construction or bridge projects, because we do have the infrastructure issues in the state of Minnesota. Every community can point to something. And if we were to stick a $500 million, or this year $400 billion, because that's half of the 8, into construction projects that were roads and bridges, I think Minnesotans would be much happier coming to and from work and to and from their obligations and recreation when they use transportation systems here in the state of Minnesota.
All right, let's turn the page a little bit here and talk about electioneering. Recently, there's been some proposals up here to sort of curtail what nonprofits can say to the public right before and you know, just prior to an election. And that's received a considerable amount of criticism and even some outrage by folks who are frankly concerned about what kind of precedent that sets. Where do you stand on the position, and maybe you can explain on the proposal, maybe you can explain a little bit to folks out there who might be a bit more curious about why that would even come up here.
Sure, a little bit of background on what we're looking at here. In the state of Minnesota, we have, as there are a lot of places, nonprofit organizations, and I would say that under the Constitution we have what we call free right of association. And so you've got some folks who've got together who have different kinds of ideas. Maybe they're advocating for one thing or another, or for or against something, and there's membership where people have voluntarily paid dues to an organization and want to be a part of that group because of the message and the belief of that group.
Yeah.
What would happen would be, under the bill that we're looking at, that Representative Winkler has put forward in the House, it would limit the ability for those organizations to promote certain kinds of candidacy issues or campaign issues or election-related issues. Representative Winkler, if he was sitting next to me, he'd say, but you know what, Representative O'Driscoll, what we're looking at is they don't have to. They just simply have to attach a list of the donors and the members of that organization who made this message possible. Well, the challenge... He's claiming he's trying to add transparency to the process.
Well, and I don't want to speak for Representative Winkler, but I've heard him address this.
And the issue that we have is that not all voluntary groups or associations are going to be treated the same way. If you get into situations where you have...
You mean under the proposal?
Well, under the way that the proposal is set up. So if you happen to be a member of a collective bargaining group where part of your dues is paid to do lobbying or electioneering kinds of things, all of the people who are members of that union wouldn't have to be attached to that particular communication that would be going out. But we're saying to nonprofits, we're going to treat you a little bit different on that. One of the things that I've got as a real concern about the way that the bill is set up is that depending upon what it is that nonprofit's working on or the political cause that they may be championing, and again, it's all across the board, is things don't happen between January and May in the state of Minnesota for the legislative session, where there isn't an election typically going on.
Right.
Things can happen where there could be a U.S. Supreme Court decision that might happen that was close to an election because they operate independent of the election cycle. There could also be something that happens in the state of Minnesota. There could be a court ruling that was struck down or some other kind of regulatory rule that's been put in place or promulgated. What would happen would be we would be limiting those organizations' ability to be able to get that message out to the general public as that group of free associated people want to be able to get that message out and leverage that. Again, it would be, you're fine to do that as if you disclose everybody who is a member of the organization, who the contributors were to that. And I think there's a little bit of a disconnect when we talk about some groups are going to be treated a little bit differently than others on that in the bill and in the process.
So where do you stand on the issue?
I think that we've been served fairly well in the state of Minnesota by that. The different groups that people would be looking at, the advocacy groups that are out there, folks I think know generally what the mission is and the ilk of the people who would be supporting those kinds of things, and I don't know if they would need to know that Tim O'Driscoll contributed $100 as a member to this organization, or if there were other dollars that people would be putting forward on that.
Wait a minute, there's two issues here. There's one where we're saying, okay, nonprofits, you can't report on things related to, you know, a particular representative or a donor or other things like that close to an election time, which is iffy on its own. But then there's this other issue which you just mentioned about transparency, where why shouldn't we know who's behind a super PAC or a PAC or why shouldn't people know that it was, you know, Greg Steinhoffel, Target's president, who donated to Emmer's group to, you know, anti-gay lobby. Well, understood, but if the same applied across the board, why not hold everybody to a certain standard of transparency? Why not know where the money's coming from?
Well, if that's going to be the idea, then we should treat everybody, as you said, and some of the others who are exempted under this bill or not included in the bill, who have different rights under that, they should also be included. So if it's an issue of fairness, then it needs to be an issue for both sides. One thing I will tell you about this type of a bill, Governor Dayton was very true to his word as governor, and I compliment him for that, and I have no reason to believe that he's going to change his position on this, which is the same as Governor Pawlenty's was for the 8 years that he was here. If we're going to be changing anything in the way of elections or anything in the way of campaign on this, it needs to have strong bipartisan support on this. And that is something that each bill that comes up, voted on its merits, and we'll see how that happens. There is no clinical definition of what strongly bipartisanly supported means. Doesn't mean that each chamber has to have bipartisan support. What happens if one chamber and one party says yes and another party in the other chamber says yes? Is that bipartisan? So I do believe that the governor will keep his word on that, that it needs to have strong bipartisan support in order for it to be included or that he will sign that, and it will change into the way we do business here in the state of Minnesota.
Yeah, I'm just curious that when we talk about bipartisan and it's in the interest of politicians alone, it's like voting yourselves a raise. The public largely doesn't have a lot of input in that, and with the lack of transparency in the way the sausage is made up here anyway, I think just people have concerns, and what we're hearing concerns. My sources tell me there's concern.
Well, and I'd like to just touch on one of the things you mentioned, and that is the pay raises that were an issue last year.
Yeah, it did come
in the
up.
legislature.
Fair enough. Yeah.
You know, here are the facts. Legislators haven't had legislative pay adjusted, I think, since the late '90s on that. Just a fact. The other part of it is that the constitutional amendment that's being put forward right now that will go on the ballot, not this year, in 2016, so almost 3 years after the bill had been passed by the House and the Senate, would establish a separate commission and committee where either directly or indirectly the governor would have the majority of the appointees on that, because the governor may appoint people or come from areas where the governor may have appointments, for example, on the courts or things that there's some temporary fill-ins and those kinds of things.
I know where you're going with
so
this.
So the governor could
Representative
actually
Driscoll.
use this as a lever against the legislature.
Yeah.
And so kind of be careful what you ask for on these kinds of things, because I think that there was a certain governor from the state of California by the name of Arnold Schwarzenegger who used that lever similar to what Minnesota is looking at doing against the legislature to get the kinds of legislation that the governor is looking for.
I can't argue with you on that, because I think you're right. It could happen. But I mean, I think the whole point is, you know, legislators would love nothing more to, like, you know, pass the buck on that so that they don't have to vote themselves a raise and then face the election consequences of that. You know, it's just not in their best interest sometimes to vote themselves a raise, hence they haven't had a raise in X amount of years. But what about a public referendum on things like that, or, you know, where does that go?
At the local level, when I was on the city council and I was mayor, those are the kinds of things that they would still have the authority to do. And I always found that discussion kind of interesting, that we would trust local counties and cities and school districts as political subdivisions of the state of Minnesota and can trust them with that decision-making process. But we at the legislature said, yeah, it's better off that we put that as a constitutional amendment and try to step away from that. I just found that to be kind of an interesting disconnect in the conversation.
Perhaps you're right. Well, last couple things on the agenda tonight, but Matt Dean, Republican colleague of yours, said, I quote, boondoggle is what he called the proposals to build a new building to house the Senate offices. I know you guys were, you sat on both sides of this issue, and you were here during the move. There was it got cantankerous, right? I mean, some DFLers that had been, especially on the Senate side, right, where they have to give up, you know, their palatial digs here and go over and sit in the office, where you and the rest of the House reside. You guys call that home, right? But that's the doghouse for senators. I mean, come on, let's face it. But anyway, you know, what's the deal on that? You just think it's politically, you guys might be helping the DFL by saying, you know, don't vote yourselves a new building during an election year.
Well,
you know.
The history on this is it didn't come through the bonding bill, and it came through a tax bill,
right,
which was questionable about the court's
process
on
yeah,
that.
right.
And the courts have ruled on that, and I also understand that that may well be under appeal as well. The long and short of it is that when you talk about a state office building of that nature, it's something that someone suggested this to me, and I thought, you know, this actually has some merit, and I don't know if we've looked at this or can look at this, but if you go about 3 blocks away from the Capitol grounds, the state of Minnesota owns an awful lot of buildings that already has vacant space in it.
Yeah.
So what would happen if we were to...
Right, like the Ford building. And
well, even down at the Centennial building, which is just down the grassy knoll from where we are here. And I don't mean to use the term grassy knoll from other history.
You lost a lot of the Kennedy...
the Kennedy constituents.
They're mad
I'm
now.
Irish just like Kennedy, so we should be good.
I hope so.
But the point being, nonetheless, is that what happens if we were to move some of the other support services and some of the other kinds of things off the campus of the Capitol grounds and move those into space that the state is already occupying instead of taking on additional space in here. I think that is well worth a look as far as using the current asset base that the state has.
Yeah, because I mean, people, when they think the Capitol is actually a small city within itself. Down here we got printing, publishing, we've got a whole bunch of security, and security would be one of those essential services, but we got everything from, the press corps moved now, but lots of stuff in this building that runs day-to-day operations. Okay.
And so, like I said, I just think that makes some sense for us to look at that and at least have had that conversation. To that same point that you were talking about with everything that's going on, discovered by people who are historians here and through the construction process, we were able to unearth about I heard the number 80,000 square feet. I don't know if that seems a little aggressive, of space in the Capitol building that otherwise was boxed in and not being able to be used as we're going through and doing this renovation. Perhaps some of that space can be converted to some of the other space that we're talking about. So I just think instead of spending $90 million right now, there are a couple of other opportunities that we could take a look at.
Kind of a make-do with what you have situation. All right, so let me put you on the spot a little bit here. You got your wallet with you? Seriously?
I do.
Okay. There's a student group up here. I'm sure you've heard about them. And they're pressing on this issue, which has long been an issue, about the get out of jail free card up here.
That's its nickname.
That's its nickname, but yeah, I understand why it exists. And I think most of our viewers, at least the politically savvy ones, will know a little bit about it. But each legislator is issued a card when they're elected up here, and you take your oath. And it basically says that law enforcement can't impede you from your duties up here. In other words, it's a get out of jail free card, as it's been coined. Let's talk about your views on that, and why so much resistance to the student group up here that wants to know.
There isn't. It went through government operations, which I sit on, and I did put some clarification for people because there was some, I won't say misinformation, some kind of incomplete information and filling this in. And the way you phrased it too, I would think that there could be some incomplete information that people are getting on
okay,
this.
well, clear it up.
The only thing that this does is it says that a legislator during session can't be detained by law enforcement to impede their duties as a legislator. So if I were to go out this evening and get into a situation where law enforcement was going to detain me, law enforcement would still have the right to prosecute me, still have the right to go forward with all of the criminal charges. I simply would have to wait until the session is done. And this goes back to do that prosecution and detention and just what happened with any other resident or citizen in the state of Minnesota. What the issue becomes is, do we still need to have that? And the framers of our Constitution, because it's not a state law, it's a constitutional issue that makes this available. It said, we want to protect against overzealous use in the governor's office, since they are the enforcement branch, that legislators who may be executing their duties could be lawfully, maybe the word, not maybe it's a little strong, but detained because they weren't quite in sync with what the governor's thoughts were on a particular item. And so we wanted to give immunity to legislators. It's not diplomatic immunity. It's not free, get out of jail free card. At best, it's delay going to jail card.
Well,
as a result of
I think
the
what gets
prosecution.
people, Representative O'Driscoll, is it's an exception in the law that the ordinary citizen doesn't enjoy. And I think, from their perspective, it's like, if I get stopped for a DWI, I can be brought to jail immediately and booked and put in a cell. A legislator can show this card and be, I think, escorted, brought in the back of a squad car to the legislator, drunk and all, and go ahead and cast their vote, which, and not face a consequence until after the session's over.
And again, that's one of the things that we've looked at and that had support in the committee that I was in, that would now be considered a breach of the peace, and that would be exempted from that.
So you mean a DWI?
Right. And that was
because the law wasn't really, and I don't mean to cut you off, but the law wasn't really meant to give you guys a free pass for a DWI, as has been reported in the press incorrectly. I mean, it does that. But that wasn't, it delays it, but that wasn't its intention. Its intention was what you outlined. And so if the clarification was made around that, although there's a whole lot of question in that.
Let me help you with that. Let me help
go
you
ahead.
with that. All right. Back in the mid-1800s, when the state of Minnesota became a state and we were looking at this, we weren't driving automobiles down roads, whether they were in good shape or not.
You could stagger up to the Capitol.
We were talking about.
I'm sure it
the
happened.
point being is, you might get, instead of a DWI, drunk while, or intoxicated while driving that, you might get it from riding your horse or a horse and a buggy kind of a thing, and so it's a little bit different kind of a situation. And so as things have evolved in the way of technology and different kinds of things, it maybe makes some sense to update these kinds of things. to still preserve the intent of that, but to modernize, if you will, what's happening. And I think that that's what has happened. Like I said, government operations in the House here a week or so ago, and we took it up. We had that, and I basically just shared with the committee and the others present the same kinds of things that we talked about. And I've been actually complimented by a lot of the folks who are constitutional scholars saying, you know what, you hit it right on the head with what it is. And I think that for some it's be made a bigger issue than it really is.
So how are you going to follow up, or have you followed up with these students, the young people that are up here trying to talk about this issue and doing some, and you know, matter of factly, they've kind of been stonewalled from researching this issue from a number of different quarters, like law enforcement, for instance. Well, there's privacy issues, et cetera, et cetera. You know, the lack of transparency doesn't help with the public perception. And problem or not.
I would say that in government operations, which is a big community that would see this, and so would civil law see this, there was the presentation by the students, and there was some discussion and some questions shared by people. And then I made my comments, and again, after I made those comments, I had folks coming up and saying, hey, you were spot on with where that's at. And I voted for the change in the definition of the breach of the peace.
Did the kids come and see you afterward?
I did not have any visitors that came before, during, or after that discussion. And again, I'm not sure which committee it's in right now and where it's at, but I do know that it had a few more stops to make after it left our government out.
What can you show us?
Yeah, I mean, it's not very exciting.
I know.
It's truly not very exciting, and I got to see if I can find it here. I know I've got it in here somewhere, and since it's something I don't use on a regular, everyday basis.
Which is good. Good you say that during an election year.
Well, it's just I don't.
Simone, can you?
Yeah, I mean, here's what it looks like.
It's from Mark Ritchie Issues.
Yeah, the Secretary, and that states the constitutional provision that it talks about. It simply has the legislator's name, and it says when it can be used and how it can be used and the date of expiration on it. So it's truly not a major item. And as a matter of fact, Secretary Ritchie doesn't even sign them himself. He's got a stamp that goes on these, if I'm not mistaken.
You know, I just myself carry the Monopoly card. You've probably seen it. The cops don't really like it.
Yeah, that doesn't really get you too much, does it?
You don't want to bump up against an Irish Flatfoot with that. You know, he's going to be a little smarter. But I appreciate your willingness to be transparent on the issue, Representative O'Driscoll, and thanks for coming on tonight.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you.
And appreciate you spending some time with us. That's all we have time for tonight. Join us next week when we'll talk about how far the progress is being made in terms of the bonding bill here at the state capitol. Thanks very much. For Minnesota Capitol News, I'm Marty Owings. Good night, everybody.